Blood and Betrayal by Sasha. Chapter 1. The Return to Darkness. The city streets had never felt as cold as they did tonight. The kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones and cling to your skin, gnawing at you like an insistent reminder. For Detective Victor Hayes, the chill wasn't just from the late autumn winds. It was the weight of what he'd seen, the weight of the ghosts that followed him from his past. He stood outside the precinct, staring at the looming building ahead, its silhouette bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. Another murder had been reported. Another body. Another life lost. Victor shoved his hands deeper into his coat pockets and exhaled a thick cloud of breath. The night was too quiet, too still. He could feel it, the tension, the kind that always gripped him just before the storm. A car door slammed behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned, recognizing the figure approaching. Detective Julia Martin, his partner and the only person who still seemed to trust him after everything. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way she moved, sharp, determined. "Got the call, too," she said, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of urgency. "Another one?" Victor asked, his voice hoarse from the weariness that had become his constant companion. Julia nodded grimly, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a nearby lamppost. "Ritualistic, they think. Same as the others." Victor swallowed hard, his stomach twisting. Ritualistic murders. He had seen his fair share over the years, but there was something about this one. Something that felt different, more personal somehow. "Where are we headed?" he asked, pushing the uneasy feeling aside. "The morgue. The body was found just outside the city limits," Julia replied, glancing at her watch. "You ready for this?" Victor hesitated. Was he ready? Could anyone truly be ready to walk into the kind of darkness he had been trying to escape for so long? The kind of darkness that was now reaching out for him again, pulling him back in. He forced a tight smile. "Ready as I'll ever be." Victor followed Julia to her car, the familiar hum of the engine filling the silence between them as they drove through the darkened streets. The city had its secrets, and tonight, it felt like they were about to uncover one of its darkest. The weight of the case pressed heavily on Victor's shoulders. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just another string of murders. The clues, so far few and cryptic, seemed to point toward something far more sinister, something that reached beyond the simple criminal motives he had become accustomed to. His thoughts drifted back to the last case he worked, a case that had nearly cost him his career and his sanity. The echoes of that investigation still haunted him. He could feel the ghost of that case, of the faces he couldn't save, lurking in the back of his mind, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. He'd barely survived it, and now this, he couldn't escape it. Julia's voice broke through his thoughts. "You know," she said, her tone soft but laced with concern, "you've been quiet tonight, too quiet." Victor turned his head, meeting her eyes briefly. There was no need for words between them. She knew him too well. But the truth was, he didn't want to admit what was really bothering him. Not to her. Not to anyone. "I'm fine," he said, his voice flat. "Just tired." She didn't press further, but Victor could see the way her eyes lingered on him, searching for any sign that things weren't as simple as he claimed. She knew. She always did. They arrived at the morgue a few minutes later. The building was stark and uninviting, its sterile white walls reflecting the harsh light from the fluorescent bulbs above. A chill ran down Victor's spine as they walked through the door, the smell of antiseptic and death thick in the air. Inside, the coroner, a heavy-set man with dark circles under his eyes, greeted them with a nod. "Detectives, over here." The body was laid out on a metal table, the sheet covering most of it, but even from a distance, Victor could see the telltale signs. The positioning, the symbols carved into the skin. The familiar feeling of dread crept up his spine. "This is the third one in as many weeks," the coroner said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Same method, same symbols, and I don't know how, but it's like they're all connected to something bigger." Victor moved closer to the table, his gaze focused on the body. The victim was a man, probably in his late 30s, with short-cropped brown hair and a clean-shaven face. His eyes, wide open in eternal shock, stared at nothing. The smell of blood was still fresh in the air, mingling with the scent of formaldehyde. "What are the symbols?" Julia asked, her voice low, as if afraid to disturb the macabre scene before them. The coroner hesitated before replying. "They're not from any known ritual or culture, at least not one I've seen before. They don't match anything in the databases. I've never seen this kind of thing in 20 years of work." Victor studied the symbols, tracing their unnatural patterns with his eyes. They were jagged, almost chaotic in their design. The marks seemed to be carved deep into the skin, as though someone had taken great care, no great pleasure in drawing them. "Something's wrong," Victor muttered under his breath. "This isn't just a murder. It's personal." Julia's brow furrowed. "You think it's someone we know?" Victor didn't answer immediately. The thought gnawed at him, but he couldn't bring himself to voice the suspicion that had begun to form in his mind. He turned away from the body, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know," he finally said, "but I've got a feeling. This one's going to be worse than anything we've dealt with before." As they examined the body and tried to piece together the strange clues, the first threads of a larger conspiracy began to weave themselves into their investigation. The city was full of secrets, secrets that no one wanted uncovered. But Victor couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that these murders were more than just isolated incidents. The case was beginning to feel like a twisted puzzle, each piece more disturbing than the last. And as they dug deeper, Victor couldn't help but feel that the killer was not just playing a game, he was sending a message. A message that Victor was somehow connected to. Chapter 2. The Shadow of the Past. Victor sat at his desk the next morning, the morning light slicing through the blinds in sharp beams. The silence of the office was oppressive, the stillness of the air mirroring the weight in his chest. He hadn't slept well. Even with the exhaustion weighing on him, sleep had been a stranger. Instead, he spent the night poring over old case files, trying to make sense of the symbols on the body. Nothing seemed to fit, and the more he dug, the deeper the mystery became. The previous night's investigation had left him with more questions than answers. The ritualistic nature of the murders was something Victor had seen before, but this time it felt different, more personal, like the killer was trying to send a message, and Victor was at the center of it. That he glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already well into the afternoon, and he hadn't even noticed the time passing. He rubbed his temples, trying to stave off the headache that had begun to build. The feeling of being watched, the weight of the eyes that followed him, had only grown stronger. It felt like someone, somewhere, was waiting for him to make the wrong move. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Victor called out, his voice tight. Julia stepped into the room, her face grim. She looked even more tired than he felt, but there was an intensity in her gaze that told him she had news, important news. "Anything?" Victor asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed him a file. "This came through this morning. Thought you'd want to see it." Victor opened the file, scanning through the pages quickly. It was a report from a local informant, someone who had claimed to know something about the murders. The report was vague, filled with cryptic details that only raised more questions. The informant referred to the killer as the Collector, a name that sent an uneasy chill down Victor's spine. The name was unfamiliar to him, but something about it felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was no coincidence that the killer was now using a title, an identity. "What do you think?" Julia asked, her voice tense. "I don't know," Victor muttered, setting the report down. "But this Collector, that's a message, not just a name. The killer is trying to draw us in." "Draw us in how?" Julia pressed. "We're already in, Victor. We've been in since the first body was found." He stood and began pacing, his mind racing. "You don't understand. This is more than just a killer on the loose. This is someone with a purpose that connects to us, to me somehow." Julia frowned, crossing her arms. "What do you mean, connects to you?" Victor's gaze flickered to the window, his mind flashing back to the nightmarish memories he'd tried to bury for years. The years he'd spent hunting down criminals, fighting demons of his own. A life he thought was behind him. But this case, this murderer, it was bringing it all back. A darkness that Victor had hoped to forget. "Victor," Julia said, her voice softening. "Talk to me." Victor took a deep breath, his throat tight. He could feel the weight of her concern, but he wasn't ready to tell her everything. Not yet. Not until he knew for sure what he was dealing with. "I can't explain it yet," he said quietly, "but I think I've seen this kind of thing before, a long time ago, and I think the killer might know something about me, something only a few people know." Julia's expression hardened. She stepped closer to him, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean? You're not making sense." Victor clenched his jaw, his mind racing. "I don't know how it's possible, Julia, but there's something in my past, something I thought I had left behind. This case, these murders, they're connected to it, and it's all coming back, like someone's digging up old bones." Julia remained silent, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he was joking. But there was no humor in Victor's eyes, only the shadows of regret and fear. "You need to talk to me," Julia urged, her voice low. You can't carry this alone. Victor shook his head, his fingers running through his hair. I can't explain it, not yet. But I need you to trust me. I have to finish this, no matter what. Julia didn't say anything at first. She studied him, the worry clear in her eyes. Finally, she spoke. All right, Victor. But if you're in this too deep, if you're not okay, I'll pull you out, no matter what. He met her gaze, nodding slightly, though he knew deep down he wouldn't allow it. He couldn't stop now. Not when everything was so close to unraveling. Victor turned his attention back to the file. We need to find out more about this collector. We need to get ahead of him before he gets ahead of us. Julia nodded, her expression resolute. I'll dig into this informant. You focus on finding out who's behind this and why. Victor's mind churned as they continued discussing the next steps. They needed answers, and they needed them quickly. But in the pit of his stomach, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and that the killer was already one step ahead. The investigation was only beginning, but Victor already felt the threads of his past tightening around him. What he had seen, what he had done, was coming back to haunt him. The deeper they went, the closer they came to something much darker. And Victor couldn't escape it, not when his own demons were the ones pulling the strings. Chapter 3. Into the darkness. Victor barely slept that night. His mind raced, tormented by fragments of memories he couldn't piece together. He had seen evil in many forms, but this was different. It felt as if he were being hunted by something that knew him better than he knew himself. And with each passing hour, he felt the noose tightening. The morning came too quickly. He could feel the weight of the case pressing on him. But there was no turning back. The clues were starting to connect. Slowly, but they were there. He had to follow them, even if it meant confronting the ghosts of his past at his desk. He sorted through the files and notes. The symbol found at the murder scene, the intricate, twisted design, was something that nagged at him. He had seen it before, but it was buried deep in his memories, too faint to recall. He could feel the pressure building in his skull. The migraine had returned, sharper this time. Victor picked up the phone and dialed Julia's number. She answered on the second ring. Yeah? She said, her voice low, as if she too felt the urgency in the air. I need you to dig into the symbol, Victor said, his voice tight. I've seen it before, but I can't remember where. It's haunting me. You think it's part of the killer's ritual? She asked, a note of concern creeping into her voice. I don't know, but I need to find out, he replied. Something's not right, Julia. This case, it's pulling me in deeper. We're dealing with more than just a murderer. She was silent for a beat. All right, I'll get on it. But you need to take care of yourself, Victor. You're not going to get anywhere if you're running on empty. Victor grunted. I'll sleep when this is over. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair. His eyes wandered over the scattered papers on his desk. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the killings weren't random. There was a purpose behind them, some twisted logic that he couldn't quite grasp yet. But the closer he got to understanding, the more dangerous it became. He grabbed his coat, putting it on with a sense of finality. There was no more time to waste. If he was going to get to the bottom of this, he had to take the next step, and that meant going into the heart of the city's underbelly, the places where secrets were buried beneath layers of dirt and lies. The dark alleyways of the city had always felt like home to Victor. He knew them like the back of his hand, every twist, every turn. But tonight, something was different. The air felt heavier, charged with a sense of foreboding. He stood outside an old, run-down building, a former warehouse now serving as the home to those who didn't ask too many questions. A place where people came to disappear, where shady deals and whispered conversations took place under the cover of darkness. Victor walked through the broken door, the creak of the hinges loud in the otherwise silent building. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and dust. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead added to the eerie atmosphere, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. "Victor," a voice called from the corner, low and cautious. He turned to see Derek, a local informant, stepping out from the darkness. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. But there was something about him, a jittery energy, that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "You got something for me?" Victor asked, his tone sharp. He didn't have time for games. Derek nodded, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they were alone. He stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. "I heard things, man. Things that tie back to that symbol. The one you've been asking about." Victor's heart rate spiked, but he kept his expression neutral. "What are you talking about?" Derek looked around again, visibly nervous. "The symbol. It's not just some random thing, all right? It's part of something bigger, something older." Victor stepped closer, ignoring the chill creeping up his spine. "What do you know, Derek?" "I'm telling you, man," Derek continued, his voice shaking. "There's a group, some kind of cult. They've been operating in the shadows for years. People think they're just an urban legend, but they're real. And they're dangerous. The symbol? It's theirs. A mark of loyalty." Victor frowned, trying to process the information. "What do they want with the murders? Why now?" Derek shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know all the details, but I know one thing, it's all connected. The killings, the ritual. The cult is trying to send a message. And I think you're part of it, Victor. I think they know about you." Victor's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" Derek didn't answer right away, his eyes darting around as if he were afraid of being overheard. "I'm not safe here anymore, man. They're coming for me. And they're coming for you too. You need to get out before it's too late." Before Victor could respond, Derek turned and bolted into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness of the building. Victor stood still, his mind racing, heart pounding in his chest. He knew Derek wasn't lying. The fear in his eyes was real, and everything Derek had just said pointed to one thing. Victor was in deeper than he had ever realized. The cult wasn't just some nameless group. They knew about him. They were targeting him. Victor had to act fast. The walls were closing in. The next few days blurred into one another. Victor dove headfirst into the investigation, barely pausing to eat or sleep. Every lead seemed to take him deeper into the labyrinth of the city's criminal world. and every answer seemed to lead to more questions. He couldn't shake the feeling that the killer was always one step ahead, watching him, waiting for him to slip up. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the conspiracy was much larger than he'd ever imagined. And all the while, the same haunting question echoed in his mind. How much of this was truly about the murders, and how much of it was about him? Chapter 4. The Web Unraveling. The city felt different now, as though it had changed overnight. The hum of the streets, the chatter of people, the distant blare of car horns. It all seemed distant, muffled by the weight pressing down on Victor. The more he uncovered, the more his life seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. The deeper he dug, the closer he came to facing the truth, and it was a truth he wasn't sure he was ready for. Victor sat at his desk, staring at the files in front of him, his mind reeling. He hadn't spoken to Julia since that phone call days ago, and his attempts to reach her had gone unanswered. Something was off. He could feel it in the air, the way the world seemed to close in on him. He had to keep going, but a gnawing feeling in his gut told him that every step forward could lead to something far worse. His phone rang, breaking the silence. He snapped it up without hesitation. "Victor," came Julia's voice, strained and tense. "We need to meet. Now." Victor's pulse quickened. "What's going on? What did you find?" "I can't talk on the phone. It's too risky," Julia replied. "Meet me at the usual place. 30 minutes. And Victor, be careful. There's something you need to know. Something big." The line went dead before he could respond. Victor's heart raced as he grabbed his coat, the sense of urgency gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The usual place wasn't far. An old diner at the edge of town, where the neon sign flickered in the dark like a ghost. He had met Julia here countless times before. A place where the shadows hid secrets and conversations were always whispered in hushed tones. But tonight it felt different. There was something heavy in the air, as if the diner itself knew the weight of the conversation about to unfold. Victor pushed open the door, the bell above it ringing with an eerie chime. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Julia sitting in the far corner booth, her back to the wall, eyes darting nervously as she glanced around. Victor slid into the booth across from her. Her face was pale, the usual confidence in her demeanor replaced by something he hadn't seen before, fear. "Julia," he said quietly, his voice sharp. "What's going on?" She looked at him for a long moment before speaking, her voice trembling slightly. "Victor, it's worse than we thought. The cult you're chasing? They're not just some random group of killers. They've been here for years, operating under our noses. And there's someone inside the department, someone close to you, involved." Victor's heart sank. "What are you talking about?" Julia hesitated. She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across the table. Victor grabbed it without thinking, opening it carefully. Inside were photographs, grainy, black and white images of crime scenes. But they weren't just any crime scenes. They were images of murders that hadn't been released to the public. Murders that mirrored the same ritualistic patterns Victor had seen in the case he was working on. He looked up at Julia, his breath catching in his throat. "These are from our cases. How did you—" One of the victims, Julia interrupted, her voice low, was connected to the cult, and there's someone in the department who's been covering up their tracks. Someone who's been feeding them information. Victor's mind raced. Who? I can't be sure yet, Julia replied, but I've been tracking a few key figures. People in the higher ranks of the department, police officials who've been involved in the investigations over the years. One name keeps coming up, but I need time to dig deeper. Victor felt a chill wash over him. You're saying there's a mole in the department? A rat? Julia nodded grimly. Yes, and I think they're watching you, Victor. I think they know you're getting close. Victor slammed his fist on the table, the impact making Julia flinch. Damn it! I knew this wasn't just some random string of murders. I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. Victor, Julia said urgently, leaning forward. There's more. The symbol you've been tracking, the one you thought was just a mark of loyalty for the cult. It's part of something far bigger. It's a ritual, Victor. A blood ritual. And it's been happening for decades. Victor froze. What do you mean, decades? The murders are only the tip of the iceberg, Julia explained. There's something else, something more sinister that no one has been able to uncover. The cult is using these killings to open a doorway to something dark. They think they can summon something from the other side, something ancient. But it's not just about power, Victor. It's about control. Victor's thoughts spiraled. Every theory he'd built up until now, every assumption was shattering in front of him. He had known the world of crime to be full of corruption. But this was beyond his understanding. A part of him wanted to dismiss it, to write it off as another delusion. But deep down, he knew Julia wasn't lying. He stood up suddenly, pushing the photographs back into the envelope. We need to get out of here. It's not safe. Julia nodded, already standing up. They moved toward the door quickly, the air around them thick with tension. But as Victor stepped outside, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. Something was wrong. He could feel eyes on him. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But there was nothing there, just a dark figure slipping into the shadows across the street. Before he could react, a voice rang out, sharp and cutting. Victor. He froze, his pulse spiking. The voice was unmistakable. The voice of someone he'd known for years. It was Detective Greg Sullivan. Thought you might show up here? Greg said, his tone laced with menace. Victor's stomach twisted into knots. The walls were closing in, and now it seemed his past was about to catch up with him. Chapter 5. Betrayal in the Shadows. Victor's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of dread and disbelief. Greg Sullivan stood across from him, his eyes cold, his stance aggressive. The air around them felt suffocating, as though the night itself was closing in. What the hell are you doing here, Greg? Victor asked, his voice low but tense. Greg's lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. I should be asking you that. You've been poking around places you shouldn't. This isn't a game, Victor. Victor's hand hovered near his side, where his gun usually rested, but he knew better than to reach for it. This wasn't a confrontation he was prepared for. Not yet, at least. Greg had always been unpredictable. a volatile mix of charm and menace. But tonight, something about him was different. It wasn't just the danger in his eyes. It was the way he spoke, like a man who had already decided how this was going to end. "Listen," Victor said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not backing off. Not now." Greg chuckled, stepping closer. "You think you have it all figured out, don't you? That's your problem, Victor. You're too damn sure of yourself." Victor bristled. "I'm not the one hiding something." Greg's expression flickered with something unreadable. Then his smile faded, replaced by something far darker. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. It's bigger than you, bigger than anything you could ever imagine. And I'm not going to let you get in the way." Victor's pulse quickened, the realization dawning on him with brutal clarity. "You're one of them. You're in on it." For a moment, Greg didn't respond, his eyes narrowing. Then he stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You don't know who you're talking to, Victor. You never did. And now, you're going to regret it." Without warning, Greg lunged at Victor, pushing him back into the shadows of the alley. Victor stumbled but caught his balance, his mind racing. This wasn't a fight he wanted, but he had no choice now. He had to survive. Greg swung first, a brutal blow aimed for Victor's stomach. Victor barely dodged in time, the punch grazing his side. He retaliated instinctively, throwing an elbow into Greg's chest. But the other detective absorbed the hit, his grip tightening around Victor's collar. "Did you think you were special?" Greg hissed, his face inches from Victor's. "That you were going to save everyone? You're just a pawn in this game, and you always have been." Victor's breath was ragged, the weight of Greg's words pressing down on him. He struggled to break free, but Greg's grip was iron-tight. "What the hell is this about? What do you want from me?" Greg's smirk returned, this time colder, more sinister. "I want you to stop. Stop digging into things that don't concern you. Stop asking questions that can't be answered. Or you'll end up like the rest of them. Forgotten." A cold shiver ran down Victor's spine. He had to get out of this. He couldn't let Greg drag him down into whatever madness he was caught up in. With one swift movement, Victor planted his knee in Greg's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. The grip loosened just enough for Victor to break free. Greg staggered back, gasping for air, but the fury in his eyes never wavered. "You'll regret this, Victor," he spat. "You're already too deep. There's no way out." Victor didn't wait for him to make another move. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears. The alley blurred around him, but he didn't stop. He had to get to Julia, had to tell her what had happened. The truth was out there, and if he was going to survive, he had to find it, before Greg and whatever dark force he served found him first. Victor didn't stop running until he reached the relative safety of his car, his mind whirling. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to calm the storm inside him. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the image they formed was far worse than he could have ever imagined. He pulled up to Julia's apartment building, his eyes scanning the parking lot. Something felt off. He parked quickly and rushed inside, barely acknowledging the doorman as he passed. Julia had to know what had just happened. She had to understand how close they were to something far more dangerous than either of them realized. Victor knocked urgently on her door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Panic gripped him. He tried the door handle, and to his surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing an apartment that looked untouched. Too untouched. There were no signs of struggle, but there was also no sign of Julia. His stomach dropped. Where was she? Victor stepped inside cautiously, his instincts on high alert. The silence was deafening. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the air, made him more certain that something was wrong. He moved through the apartment, checking every room, every closet. Nothing. But then, in the living room, something caught his eye. A single sheet of paper on the coffee table. It was a photograph, but not one Victor recognized. He picked it up, his fingers trembling as he stared at the image. It was a picture of him, but not the Victor he knew. This was the version of him that had been captured in surveillance footage. Cold, detached, a stranger to himself. Victor felt the blood drain from his face. Someone was watching him. Someone knew everything. And Julia? She was gone. Chapter 6. The Edge of Despair. Victor stood frozen, the photograph gripped tightly in his hand. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he had just seen. The image of him, the stranger in the surveillance footage, was too perfect, too calculated. Someone had been watching him. They knew exactly what he had been doing. And now Julia was missing. His heart pounded in his chest as he dropped the photograph back onto the coffee table. He couldn't afford to panic, not yet. He had to think, had to figure out what had happened to her, and fast. The room felt suffocating as he scanned the apartment once again. Nothing about the place looked disturbed. No sign of forced entry, no obvious clues as to where she had gone. It was as if she had simply vanished. Victor's thoughts raced back to the conversation he'd had with Greg. The warning, the threat. His mind clung to the memory of Greg's cold eyes, the way he had taunted him, as if he knew exactly how this would play out. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Greg hadn't just been a part of the investigation. He was one of them. He had been orchestrating this all along. With grim resolve, Victor pulled out his phone and dialed the number of the only person who might have information on what was going on. Detective Ava Matthews. He had worked with her before. She wasn't part of this twisted web, and she might still be trusted. As the phone rang, his nerves sharpened. "Ava, it's Victor," he said when she picked up, his voice low and urgent. "I need your help. Julia's gone. I need to find her now." There was a pause on the other end, the silence thick with tension. "What do you mean, gone?" Ava asked carefully. "I don't know where she is. I was just at her apartment. It's empty, but it looks like someone's been watching me. I think—" Victor hesitated, the weight of his next words heavy in his chest. "I think Greg's involved. I think he's behind this." Ava's voice hardened, the concern evident. "Victor, slow down. Are you sure about Greg? He's a good cop. He's been with the force for years." "Yeah, and that's the problem," Victor snapped. "He's been hiding in plain sight. He's the last person I thought would be behind something like this. There was a long pause, and Victor could almost hear Ava's wheels turning. Okay, she said, her voice steady. I'll help you, but we need to move fast. If Greg's involved in this, we're dealing with something much bigger than just a few murders. Victor closed his eyes, the exhaustion creeping in. But he couldn't afford to rest. Not now. Where should we start? Meet me at the old warehouse by the docks. I've got a lead. I'll send you the coordinates. Victor didn't hesitate. He hung up the phone, his mind still spinning. If Greg was behind everything, then that meant he had to know exactly where Julia was. And whatever was happening, it was only going to get worse. As he left the apartment, the photograph still burned in his mind. It was a warning. Someone was watching him, and they knew everything. Victor's car roared down the dark streets as he made his way to the warehouse. The rain had started to fall again, drumming on the roof of his car in a rhythmic pattern that seemed to match the pounding in his chest. He didn't want to admit it, but the fear was settling in. Julia was the last person he could afford to lose. She had been his anchor, the one person who kept him grounded in a world that felt like it was slipping further and further into madness. If she was gone, no, he couldn't let himself think that way. Not yet. The warehouse loomed ahead, an imposing structure against the stormy sky. The flickering streetlights cast long shadows, making the place feel even more abandoned than it already was. Victor parked his car and stepped out, his coat flapping in the wind. He had to keep his focus. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about Julia, about the people who were behind all of this. He stepped inside the warehouse, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. He spotted Ava almost immediately, standing in the center of the room, a single light bulb casting a faint glow over her figure. She looked up as he approached, her expression grim. "You got something?" Victor asked, his voice urgent. Ava nodded and handed him a thick manila folder. "This came from one of my sources. It's about Greg. There's something you need to see." Victor took the folder and flipped it open. Inside were photographs, grainy, taken from a distance but unmistakable. Greg Sullivan standing outside the very same warehouse. In another, Greg was talking to a man Victor didn't recognize, someone who looked out of place. There were more pictures, each one showing Greg at different locations, always with the same man, always looking over his shoulder, as if he knew he was being watched. "This doesn't make sense," Victor murmured, staring at the photos. "Why would Greg be here?" Ava crossed her arms. "It's not just here. Look at the dates. The man he's meeting, it's the same person from the surveillance footage. The one who's been tracking you." Victor's blood ran cold. "You think Greg's working with him?" Ava's jaw clenched. "I don't know, but this goes deeper than we thought. Whoever's behind this, they've been planning it for a long time. And they're not just after you, Victor. They're after everything." Victor felt the weight of her words sink in. This wasn't just about a series of murders. It was about something much bigger. Someone was orchestrating a game, and he and Julia were pawns in it. The photo in his pocket, the one of him, burned against his skin. He had been right. Whoever was behind this had been watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, With every piece falling into place, Victor knew that the real nightmare was only just beginning. Chapter 7. Beneath the surface. Victor's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he sped down the rain-soaked streets. Ava's words echoed in his mind. "They're after everything." He wasn't sure what that meant, but the unease crawling along his spine told him that he didn't want to find out. It wasn't just about Julia anymore. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. The city outside seemed to blur in a haze of water and lights, the darkened alleyways and flickering street lamps offering no comfort. He had spent years as a detective, chasing down leads, facing down criminals, but nothing had ever felt this personal. Nothing had ever felt this dangerous. Ava had promised him information, something about Greg's connections, how far they went, who else was involved. He had hoped it would give him answers, a way to dismantle the mess he had stumbled into. But when Ava had handed him the folder at the warehouse, it had only deepened the questions. Greg's ties to the mysterious man were clear, but it still didn't explain why someone like Greg would be involved in something so sinister. Greg had always been the model cop, serious, dedicated, never a hint of corruption in his work. But the photographs painted a different picture. And the more Victor thought about it, the more he realized the only way to get to the truth was to confront Greg directly. But Greg wasn't the only problem. The man in the photographs, the one who had been following him, who had been watching his every move, was still out there. That man had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and the longer Victor delayed, the more he risked losing any chance of stopping him. Victor pulled up to the small cafe on the corner of 5th and Main, the one where he and Greg had shared many quiet conversations over the years. It was the place Greg had always chosen when they needed to talk about the harder cases. Victor needed to meet him, to see what Greg would say. To understand what had changed, he stepped out of the car, his coat pulled tight against the wind and rain, and headed inside. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, the warmth of the cafe a stark contrast to the chill outside. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes landing on the back booth where Greg sat. As always, Greg looked calm, collected. He was reading something, his coffee half finished, his brow furrowed in thought. He hadn't noticed Victor yet. Victor approached the table, his steps slow, deliberate. He wasn't sure what he would say to Greg. What words could explain what had been happening? What could he say to the man he had trusted for years, the man he had considered a friend, when that trust was now in tatters? Greg looked up as Victor reached the booth, his face betraying nothing, his eyes cold and calculating. "Victor," he greeted, his voice calm. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Victor didn't sit down. He didn't trust himself to sit down just yet. His hand tightened around the folder he had brought with him, and he placed it on the table, pushing it toward Greg. "You should take a look at this." Greg's eyes flicked to the folder, then back up to Victor, his expression unreadable. "You think you can just waltz in here, throw some papers on the table, and expect me to explain everything?" Victor leaned in, his voice low. "I think you owe me an explanation. For everything. The murders, Julia, the man following me, your role in all of this." Greg's face didn't change. He didn't flinch or react the way Victor had expected. Instead, He simply folded his hands in front of him and stared at Victor, his expression hardening. "You're in over your head, Victor. You have no idea what's really going on." Victor's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. "Then tell me, what's really going on? Why are you involved in this? What's your part in it all?" Greg sighed, leaning back in his seat. "You don't want to know, Victor. Some things are better left in the dark. You're asking questions that should never be asked." "I'm asking because I have to know," Victor snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "I have to know where Julia is. I have to know what this is all about." Greg looked down at his hands, his fingers tapping idly on the table as though he was weighing something, considering his next move. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft. "You think this is about Julia? You think this is about one woman? You've been looking in the wrong places." Victor's frustration boiled over. "Then tell me where to look, Greg. Tell me what I'm missing." For a moment, Greg didn't answer. Then, with a bitter laugh, he spoke again. "It's not just about Julia. It's about power, control. You've been chasing ghosts, Victor. The truth is much darker than you can imagine. And if you keep pushing, if you keep digging, you're going to lose everything, just like I did." Victor felt a chill run down his spine. Something about Greg's words felt final, as if this conversation was a warning, not a plea for understanding. He clenched his fists. "I don't care about the risks, Greg. I need to find Julia. Now." Greg's eyes flickered with something, regret, perhaps, or something darker. But before he could say anything more, the door to the cafe swung open. Victor's heart skipped a beat as he turned to see who had entered. His eyes locked with a familiar face. A face that didn't belong here. It was the man from the surveillance footage, the same one who had been watching him. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't supposed to happen now. Victor's hand instinctively reached for the gun at his side, but the man had already spotted him. The stranger's smile was cold, calculated. "I knew we'd meet again, Victor." Victor's mind raced as he stood up. "What do you want?" The man's smile deepened. "I want everything you've been looking for, and I'm going to make sure you never get the answers you're after." Before Victor could respond, the man pulled a gun from under his jacket and aimed it directly at Greg. The cafe went silent, the air thick with tension. Greg's face was stone, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew what was coming, and Victor realized with horror that the last piece of the puzzle was finally falling into place. The man wasn't just after Victor. He was after them all. Chapter 8. Breaking point. The silence in the cafe was suffocating, thick with the weight of unspoken words. The cold barrel of the gun pressed directly against Greg's forehead, and for the first time since they had met, Victor saw fear flicker across Greg's face. It was brief, gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough. This wasn't just a casual threat. This was serious. This was life or death. Victor's mind raced as he assessed the situation. The man, tall, dark-haired, with sharp features and an unsettling calmness in his eyes, wasn't just some random thug. He was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And the fact that he had shown up here at this moment confirmed what Victor had feared. He was being watched. And Greg had known all along. Victor, Greg said, his voice hoarse. You need to get out of here. Now. Victor's gaze flickered to Greg, his mind working overtime. He had no intention of running, not when he was this close to the truth. But he also knew that with a gun aimed at Greg's head, there was no time to waste. Who are you? Victor demanded, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. What do you want with us? The man's lips curled into a grin. It's not about what I want with you, Victor. It's about what's about to happen to you. And your precious little investigation. You've dug too deep, and now you've found yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Victor's hand twitched at his side, his fingers itching for the gun holstered beneath his jacket. He didn't trust himself to make a move just yet. One wrong move, and Greg would be dead. The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. You don't want to do anything rash, detective. You think you can play this game, but you're out of your depth. This isn't a game you can win. Victor's jaw clenched as he took a step forward, slowly, carefully. I don't believe you. I've seen your face. I know what you're a part of. The man's smile didn't falter. You don't know anything, Victor. You never did. Greg shifted slightly, his body tense, but he remained still. Victor could see the resignation in his eyes, the weight of years of secrets finally coming to the surface. But Greg didn't speak, didn't give anything away. It was as if he had accepted his fate. Whatever that was. Victor's eyes darted between the man and Greg. The pressure was unbearable. He couldn't just stand there. He had to do something. But the man was always one step ahead. His finger twitched on the trigger. I'm not going to let you kill him, Victor said, his voice firm, his pulse pounding in his ears. The man chuckled, low and mocking. You really think you have a choice? You've already crossed the line, detective. You're in this now, whether you want to be or not. Victor's mind raced. He had to think fast. He couldn't let this man kill Greg. He couldn't let his only lead slip through his fingers. Let him go, Victor said, his voice low and steady. And I'll walk away. I won't report this. I won't make a scene. You'll get what you want. The man's grin faded, his eyes narrowing as if he was sizing Victor up, calculating whether he believed him or not. For a long moment, there was only silence between them, the air thick with tension, the threat of violence hanging in the balance. But then, just as Victor felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, the man lowered the gun slightly, his posture relaxing, but not entirely. You're not the first to make me an offer like that, he said with a cruel smile. But here's the thing, Victor. There are no deals to be made. You're either with us or against us. And if you're against us... He let the threat hang in the air, unfinished, but clear. Victor's chest tightened. This was worse than he thought. He had known things were bigger than just one murder, but this was an operation, a vast, well-organized network, and he had been foolish enough to think he could take it down by himself. The man looked at Greg one last time, then back at Victor. I'm giving you one chance, detective. Walk away and we won't have to make this ugly. You want answers? You'll get them soon enough. But the more you dig, the deeper you go, the more you put yourself in harm's way. Victor didn't flinch. He couldn't. But his mind was racing. The man had just given him an opening, a clue. "You'll regret this," Victor said quietly, though his words carried weight. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The man's eyes hardened. "You don't know who you're dealing with either." In one swift motion, he turned on his heel, heading for the door. The sharp click of his boots on the floor echoed as he disappeared into the night, leaving the cafe in a tense, suffocating silence. Victor didn't move for several long moments. His heart was still hammering in his chest, the adrenaline from the confrontation making his hands shake. He looked at Greg, who was still seated, his face a mask of stone. "Greg," Victor started, but the words faltered. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know where to begin. Greg's eyes met his. "You don't get it? Do you, Victor?" His voice was quiet, almost resigned. "This isn't just about solving a few murders. This is about survival. And you're not going to make it out of this alive if you keep pushing." Victor's mind reeled. He didn't know what to make of Greg's words, or the way they had been said. He had trusted Greg for years. They had been partners. But now, everything was in question. "I don't care if it's dangerous," Victor replied, his voice cold. "I need to know the truth." Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair, the weight of their history between them thick in the air. "You can't handle the truth, Victor. No one can." For the first time in their partnership, Victor felt a cold, creeping doubt settle in his stomach. Was Greg part of this? Was he involved in something much darker than Victor had ever imagined? Before he could speak again, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. An unknown number. He answered, his voice tense. "Victor." "Detective," a familiar voice said. But it wasn't Greg. It wasn't the man either. It was someone new, someone far more dangerous. "We've been watching you," the voice continued. "And if you think you've seen the worst of this, you're wrong. This is only the beginning." Victor's blood ran cold. Chapter 9. The Depths of Deception. Victor's hand tightened around his phone, his mind scrambling to process the voice on the other end. He was used to danger, used to threats. But this was different. This felt personal. "We've been watching you," the voice repeated, cold and detached. "And if you think you've seen the worst of this, you're wrong. This is only the beginning." Victor's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at Greg, whose face remained an unreadable mask. The silence between them hung heavy, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on both of them. "I don't know who you are, but I'm done being your pawn," Victor said, his voice a low growl. "What do you want?" The voice on the other end chuckled softly, almost mockingly. "What do we want? You're asking the wrong question, detective. The real question is, what will you do when you have nothing left? When everything you thought you knew falls apart?" Victor clenched his jaw, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "This is bigger than you're letting on," he said, a hard edge creeping into his voice. "Who are you working for?" Another laugh, but this one was tinged with bitterness. "You're too late to ask the right questions. The people behind all of this, they're untouchable. You won't get to them. You won't get to us." Victor's fingers tightened around the phone, the words seeping into his mind like a poison. He didn't know who these people were, but he knew they were connected to the murders. And Greg had to know more than he was letting on. Enough games, Victor snapped. You're trying to scare me, but you won't win. Not this time. The voice on the other end was quieter now, almost thoughtful. We don't need to scare you, Victor. You're already scared. You just don't realize it yet. Before Victor could respond, the line went dead. His mind raced. This was no random killer, no lone madman. This was an organized effort, a group operating in the shadows, pulling strings in ways he couldn't even comprehend. And someone, somewhere, was controlling it all. That he shoved his phone into his pocket, his gaze never leaving Greg's. Who are they, Greg? He demanded, his voice harsh. What is this? Greg looked away, his jaw working as if he were considering something. The tension in the air was palpable. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. They're the ones who took my sister. Victor's mind reeled. Your sister? Greg nodded slowly, his eyes clouded with pain. They've been playing me all along. They've had me wrapped around their finger for years. I was too blinded by guilt, too deep in the game to see it. He paused, looking at Victor, his eyes full of regret. I never wanted this, Victor, but I can't get out. I can't leave. Victor's heart twisted at the rawness in Greg's voice. He had known Greg for years, seen him at his worst. But this was a new level of desperation. Greg was tangled in something far darker than Victor had ever imagined. What do you mean? Victor asked, his voice softer now. How did they take your sister? Greg's face twisted in agony, and for a moment, Victor saw the burden of years of torment in his eyes. They're not just killers. They're not just running some criminal enterprise. They're part of something much bigger. They want power, control, and they've been using me to get it. Victor's mind was spinning. He had no idea where to start, no clear path forward. You have to tell me everything, Greg. I can't help you if you don't. Greg looked away, his eyes focused on something distant, lost in thought. I never wanted you involved in this, Victor. You're too close. You don't understand what they're capable of. His voice dropped to a near whisper. They can destroy you with a single phone call. They'll make sure no one believes you, no one listens. Victor felt a cold chill creep down his spine. He had seen the lengths to which these people would go. But hearing Greg's confession, seeing the fear in his eyes, it made the danger feel more real, more imminent. Who are they, Greg? Victor pressed, his frustration boiling over. Who is behind this? Greg hesitated, looking as if he might break down at any moment. Then, finally, he spoke the words that would change everything. The syndicate, Greg said, his voice barely audible. They control everything, and they've had me working for them all along. Victor's stomach dropped. The syndicate. He had heard whispers of them, rumors about a shadow organization with connections in every corner of the world. But to hear it from Greg, to know that they had been pulling the strings all this time, it was too much to process. The syndicate, Victor repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. What do they want? Greg's expression hardened, his fists clenched at his sides. They want power, Victor, control over everything, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. They've been using me to track down their enemies, eliminate anyone who threatens them. Victor's mind raced. He couldn't fathom what Greg was saying, but he could feel the weight of it, the magnitude of what they were up against. I need to find them, Victor said, his voice resolute. I need to stop them. I won't let them get away with this. Greg's eyes locked onto his. You don't understand, Victor. It's too late for that. Victor's chest tightened. What do you mean? They've been watching you too, Greg said quietly. You're just another piece in their game. Victor felt the blood drain from his face. The gravity of Greg's words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been a pawn in their game all along, just like Greg. And now they were closing in. You're not safe, Greg continued, his voice full of regret. None of us are. Chapter 10. The Final Betrayal. Victor stood in the middle of the sterile, dimly lit room, his heart pounding as the weight of the last few minutes pressed down on him like a vice. He had been in tight spots before, but nothing like this. The revelation that the syndicate, the shadow organization he had only heard rumors about, was behind everything had turned his world upside down. Greg's words echoed in his mind. You're just another piece in their game. That was the terrifying truth Victor had to face. He was expendable, just like everyone else. The syndicate had played him from the beginning, pulling him into their web of lies and deception. And now, the game was coming to an end. Victor's hand tightened around the gun in his grip, the cold steel grounding him. He knew the risks, he knew the stakes, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He had seen too much, and he wasn't going to let this end in another one of their victories. The door to the room creaked open, and Victor's pulse spiked. He was ready. He had expected them to come, knew they would. But it wasn't just one man who stepped through the door. It was a team of syndicate operatives, their cold eyes scanning the room like predators closing in on their prey. At the front of the group stood someone Victor recognized instantly, Alexander Moreau. The man who had been his ally, his friend, had now become his executioner. Victor, Alexander said, his voice low and controlled, a hint of amusement in his eyes. I was hoping we wouldn't have to meet like this. Victor's grip tightened around the gun, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. You really think I'd just let you walk out of here? After everything you've done? Alexander's smile never reached his eyes. You were never supposed to know. You were never supposed to dig this deep. But here we are. Victor's mind raced, memories of their past conversations flooding back. Alexander had always been charming, always had the right words to calm him, to make him believe they were on the same side. But now, looking at him, Victor saw the truth. Alexander had been one of them all along. Why? Victor spat, his voice full of anger and betrayal. Why did you drag me into this? Alexander's smile faded, replaced with something colder, more calculated. Because you were the perfect tool. You wanted justice, Victor. You wanted answers. But you were too blind to see the bigger picture. You were always just a pawn, a means to an end. Victor's blood boiled as he took a step forward, the gun trembling in his hand. I won't let you get away with this. Alexander raised his hands in mock surrender. "You're too late, Victor. The game is over. We've already won." The door behind him slammed shut, and Victor's heart dropped as he realized just how trapped he truly was. He was surrounded, outnumbered, with no way out. But he wasn't done. Wide in a flash, Victor lunged, his body moving with the speed and precision honed by years of experience. The first two operatives didn't even have time to react before they were on the ground, incapacitated by the force of Victor's attack. He didn't stop to look back, didn't hesitate for a moment. His focus was laser sharp, every move calculated to take down the syndicate one by one. Alexander watched, his face a mask of amusement. "You really think you can stop this, Victor?" he called out, his voice mocking. "You're nothing but a broken tool." Victor's chest tightened with each step, his body moving on instinct as he fought through the chaos. Every punch, every move was fueled by a single purpose: survival. With the last operative taken down, Victor turned to face Alexander, his breath heavy in his chest. "It ends here." Alexander laughed softly, shaking his head. "You think you've won? You've only just begun to understand the truth." Victor's eyes narrowed, the gun still steady in his hands. "I know enough." For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if the world had stopped, the tension between them palpable, heavy with the weight of their shared history. Alexander's gaze flickered to the door, to the remains of his fallen men. The syndicate was falling apart, and he knew it. Victor stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm going to take you down. The syndicate ends now." Alexander's expression hardened. He had underestimated Victor's resolve. The man who had once been his ally was now his greatest threat. But Alexander wasn't a man to go down easily. He moved with lightning speed, drawing a hidden weapon from his jacket. The two of them stood there, locked in a deadly standoff, each waiting for the other to make the first move. But Victor was faster. With a precise shot, he took Alexander down, the bullet piercing through his chest before he could even react. Alexander collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide in shock as life drained from him. Victor didn't flinch. He didn't feel the rush of victory. All he felt was emptiness, the weight of what he had just done. Victor stood over him, staring down at the man who had been his friend, his ally, his betrayer. Alexander was gone, and so was the syndicate's grip on him. But the cost was heavy. The pain of betrayal ran deep. Victor turned and walked toward the door, the echoes of his footsteps hollow in the silence. He had won. But at what cost? The syndicate was no more. The conspiracy was over. But for Victor, the scars of this journey would never fade. He had lost too much, seen too much, and as he stepped out into the night, he knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice had never been so personal.